this could be a turning point for Ukraine as it finds itself on its heels in a war of attrition. To what extent will that frame the conversation today in Alaska?
Well, first of all, it's good to be back on, and thanks for asking me.
Yes, sir.
There are a lot of people looking at what's going on the ground there, and I think Mr. Putin desperately wants this to be seen as a big advance to set his position at this negotiation table. But let's just look at a couple of facts. In the last 14 months, Russia has lost over 400,000 men, and they haven't gained even 1% of Ukrainian territory. That doesn't sound like a big advance to me.
Okay, fascinating. You, of course, were a highly decorated general in the United States Air Force, to be clear. And there's been a lot of discussion around a so-called air truce. Vladimir Putin floated this idea while fighting apparently would continue raging on the ground. Is there any point? Would it protect civilians? And is this a non-starter for Ukraine?
I think it's a non-starter in general. It's especially a non-starter for our president. Remember what our president has said now for weeks. He wants to stop the killing. He wants to stop the loss of life. And Mr. Putin is going to try to wiggle his way into continuing this war. I think that the first and foremost signal of success for our president in these negotiations, since he's set the possibility of future meetings, is that today we need to walk away with a minimum of a complete ceasefire. And then if we get that ceasefire, we start moving towards something, a word that the president has started to use in the last 3 days, a peace. And we in the military like to call that a durable peace, meaning it will stand.
Mm-hmm. You spent enough time in the cockpit of an F-16 to understand the way a jet like that, which Ukraine had asked for, I think maybe 2 years before they actually ever received one, to understand what that would have meant for the air war in Ukraine. Should those fighter jets have been delivered earlier, and should they have come from the United States?
So I would never sort of pretend to correct you, but Ukraine started identifying F-16s back in 2012. My predecessor, the Admiral Stavridis, my predecessor as the SACEUR of NATO, he started a study which the staff under me finished back in 2013, and we were looking at what Ukraine needed to become a more Western-style military. At that time, Ukraine was asking for F-16s, and that study, commissioned by Stavridis, finished by me, identified back in 2013 that they needed F-16. So Ukraine has been seeking, and the military has been recommending F-16s since 2013.
Well, that's fascinating. So obviously you think they should have been delivered earlier. If Ukraine had a fleet of F-16s before Russia invaded, would this war have ever happened?
Well, it would certainly have been different. Now, remember that this war is 11 years old. This, a lot of people, and may I not be sounding too critical of you, but a lot of the press like to say this is a 3.5-year war. It's an 11-year war. It started in the spring of 2014, where we had the invasion and occupation of Crimea, then a partial invasion of the Donbass around Lugansk and Donetsk. All of that happened in the spring of 2014. That hot fight lasted for almost 2 years, and then there was a warm fight on what was called the line of contact for the next 6 to 8 years before this last 3.5 years of hot war, the third phase of the 11-year-long war, came along. So the bottom line is you're asking a tough question. The F-16s, if they had been introduced immediately back then, would probably not have made a big difference because the military wouldn't have been proficient in using them. But certainly if we had listened to the recommendations and started providing them with F-16s back in 2013 or 2014, by now the F-16s would be a major feature in this battle, and I believe it would be very different.
This is fascinating perspective. And as we do go back to the annexation of Crimea, we were just showing a map to our viewers here of Ukraine and that red line along the eastern border that is the Donbass going all the way down to Crimea. There are ideas about freezing lines in place. That's what certainly Vladimir Putin was asking for. It's also been suggested there could be some sort of demilitarized zone in the Donbass, General. Is that a consideration?
Well, here's what Mr. Putin wants. He has smashed his army now for years against the defensive line of Ukraine, which is holding in the western part of the Donbass. Mr. Putin is unable to take that from Ukraine. As I said, he's lost over 400,000 soldiers in the last 14 months trying to break that line. And so what he can't take, he now hopes the United States or the West will give him in these negotiations. He cannot break that line, and he wants us to do that work for him. So any freezing of lines or any sort of demilitarized zone, a la North Korea, et cetera, that needs to be built from the line of contact now to the east. We should absolutely 100% never give Russia land on the west side of the fortified part of the Donbass.
Okay. This is really interesting, General, because it doesn't sound to me like you see Ukraine on the brink of failure here. It is, in fact, Russia that has lost so many troops, to your point. To what extent is manpower a restrictive force for Ukraine?
Can I give you a couple of more data points? I mean, Ukraine actually fought into the Kursk Donbass or Kursk Oblast in Russia and owned a big chunk of land. Russia was absolutely unable to take their land back by themselves. They imported 20,000 North Koreans to help them, and those North Koreans got chewed up in a big way, and Russia still has not taken back its own sovereign land inside of Russia. And now we see Russia asking for more North Koreans because they're in such manpower difficulty. And just in the last month and a half, Russia has imported almost 20,000 North Koreans to run the factories in Russia because Russia has a demographic problem and they don't have enough people to run their own military industrial complex factories. So does this sound like a nation that's winning a war?
Fascinating. You were, of course, as we mentioned, Commander, U.S. European Command and Supreme Allied Commander Europe of NATO Allied Command Operations. What does this summit mean for Europe if there are no European leaders at the table?
Well, that's unfortunate. I mean, we in the West have had sort of two rules. Mr. Putin desperately wants to deal with America and make decisions about Europe. We've always kept Europe at the table, but this is a different case here in Alaska. Additionally, we have always in the West, you can remember this all the way back to President Obama's time, we say nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. In other words, we're not going to deal with Russia about Ukraine. And I think you see the president now adopting a similar approach. He has said he's not going to talk land swaps and things. That is going to have to be done between the three, the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine. And I would hope they would include Europe in that as well. But the bottom line is we need to make sure that when Ukraine is deals are made on Ukrainian land, that Zelensky is at the table. We cannot, as the president has said himself in the last day and a half, we're not going to make decisions like that for Ukraine. Ukraine has to be a part of it.
Understood, General. Sorry to interrupt you. As we spend time with General Breedlove, we're showing our viewers on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube now a live view of the runway, the arrival platform, if you will, at the joint base. As you see a uniformed gentleman walking in front of the Alaska 2025 sign. There's literally a red carpet on the runway and 4 American fighter jets lined up here at the Alaska 2025 sign. General, it almost looks like something that you would see in an Olympic village, save the fighter jets. The staging here is fascinating, and I'm wondering, as someone who held a leadership role in the Pentagon, what you make of the fact that the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, is not on this trip. He stayed behind in Washington despite the fact that it's being hosted at a U.S. military base.
Listen, I don't do politics. It's never been something that I engage in as a senior military leader. I like to keep out of politics. So I'm not going to grade the president's paper on who's at or who's not at the table. I will say Elbendorf Air Force Base there has often held these kinds of very important meetings and things, and they know how to roll out the red carpet. And quite frankly, I'm glad our U.S. military decided to give Mr. Putin a little show of real air power as he steps off of his airplane. As you know, air power has largely failed Russia in Ukraine. They have been unable to establish air superiority over even their own troops there, and that would be a major malfunction in a Western campaign.